All right, greetings from the dark continent, Conscious Caracal here, or Adams van Sale. And as you might notice, I sound a bit different, I hope, seeing as I have a new microphone, still ironing out whether the levels are correct. If you have any feedback on it, don't hesitate to put that in the chat. Welcome, everyone. Sorry for the little bit of a content hiatus on this channel for the past 3 weeks. Moved into a new place. You can see the background is a bit different, but at the same time, I'm still going to be working on it. That is not the permanent new background. I have a few plans that I need to execute in regards to what I want for the background. But so far, this is what you get. But I think it's pretty good. I see here Hindo in the chat says sound is good. Thank you very much. Also, just a shout out to Yanni for helping me with the microphone. He gave me some advice on what the best affordable option for me was, and I'm going to have to listen back to this episode afterwards to see if I'm happy with the sound. But it seems like you guys are chuffed. So tonight we have an interesting show, seeing as I'm going to be reading from my master's thesis that I did on redistributive populism and property rights, where I compared Venezuela, Uruguay, Botswana, and Zimbabwe as 4 case studies, and I compared their policies that they used and also the outcomes that they achieved. So I see Elvo, a very cool profile picture you have there. Bayamoy. He says you have 666 subs. I think I have a little bit more than that. I think the shortened version is 666, but it's 6,660. So it's a bit better. But I also noticed that you guys need to change that, get those subs up so I can get past the 666 little shortened version. I don't like that at all. Indo's got the right idea. So there's a lot of content that we need to get to tonight. So I'm not going to be just hanging around too much. I see a sideline opinion says, good to see you back on the podcast, Hunting Fields again, CC. Well, thank you very much for tuning in. Oh, I need to put out this tweet to let people know that I'm live. All right. So tonight, as I said, we're going to be going through the content of my master's thesis, and we're going to probably need to start off with just some information. I'm going to be reading from the thesis, but if you have anything that I say that you want to go check for yourself, the link is in the description to the full thesis that you can go download and read. And if you want to go check anything that I said, all the bibliography is there and all my sources are there as well. So you can go check it out. Link in the description. So let's start off with what is redistributive populism. And I think that's the big question, seeing as it's not a term that's popularly used, but it's something that I thought matched what the phenomenon that I was describing. I see a spiritual man that says Dumelang. Good evening. All right, so let's jump in. Redistributive populist policies ideally aim to promote broad development and growth without exacerbating class conflict through making use of idle capacity and resources. So this is the ideal version. I'm not saying this is the way to go, but this is what ideally on paper, what they try to achieve. In reality, such policies involve radical redistributive measures and an expansion of aggregate demand. In order to achieve a more equal transfer of income from the rich to the poor, an appreciation of the real exchange rate, and a reduction in export promoting measures is utilized. Redistributive populists display a tendency to nationalize economically viable foreign-owned enterprises, and the result is that owners of primary resources find it harder to sell their product abroad, while poor urban workers experience real wage increases. In order to avoid inflationary pressure and to preserve the living standards of the poor as well as the real value of their wages, populist governments then implement price controls and peg the nominal exchange rate. Extra demand is met through running down inventories and imports, and the exchange rate is artificially kept stable through the sale of foreign reserves. So that's a very short summary. And there's actually something that I wanted to highlight before we get into the 4 case studies, and that is the different phases that redistributive populist regimes usually follow in regards to their policies and also the outcomes. So let me just get that up here. So by studying Chile and Peru, Dornbush and Edwards identified 4 stages of countries that come under the control of redistributive populist regimes. So, just maybe one little thing before I get into that. So, redistributive populism is a, a form of a variant of left-wing populism. So there's a rise in populism all across the Western world, but also in the global South. In the global South, we see more of an increase in redistributive populism or left-wing populism, while in the West, we saw a big increase in right-wing populism, but that seems to have died down a little bit. So just one thing here, I'm looking for that definition that I used. Here we go. Yeah. So expropriation without compensation in South Africa, for example, is an example of a redistributive populist policy. So redistributive populism unites the people around the central goal of resource redistribution. This approach to populism, which transcends orthodox dividers and unifiers, builds electoral support around issues such as resource redistribution, poverty and inequality, and the economic freedom fighters. The EFF party in South Africa is an example of a redistributive populist party. So let's get into the phases that usually accompany this type of regime. So, as I said, this is based on the work of Dornbush and Edwards, 1990. So, during stage 1, which encompasses approximately the first year or two after a redistributive populist party comes into power, the structure of the economy is radically transformed through extensive nationalization programs. I mean, that sounds pretty familiar if you're South African. And consumption levels of goods and services rise, especially among the poor. Inflation is artificially kept in check by price controls, and any input or product shortage is supplemented by imports, while the economy is steadily restructured to make it less dependent on imports. The reserve depletion finances the imports and replaces internal replenishing of inventories. And now, stage 2 brings about the first economic bottlenecks as a consequence of the combined effect of significant increases in demand for goods, as well as the scarcity of foreign exchange reserves. The inventory depletion seen in stage 1 starts to cause problems for the economy. Expansive price and exchange rate controls become necessary to maintain the growth and value of real wages from stage 1, and government expenditure continues to increase, and inflation can no longer be kept in check. However, real wages remain relatively stable. A large and continually expanding underground informal economy emerges. Increased subsidies on wages and goods and foreign exchange shortages drastically worsen the government's growing budget deficit. Redistributive populist regimes finding themselves in this position commonly disregard the orthodox economic advice given by institutions such as the IMF and World Bank. Stage 3 is characterized by extensive shortages, high or hyperinflation, mass capital flight, demonetization of the economy. That's not demonetization as in with YouTube, as well as critical foreign exchange shortages. Tax revenues decline steeply while the government is unable to sufficiently reduce its expenditure, resulting in an exponential deterioration of the budget deficit. In desperation, the government cuts subsidies where possible, which results in real wages falling drastically. As you remember, these wages were subsidized in the previous phase to keep them where they were, and all of the above lead to increased poverty and political instability. Stage 4, a new regime commonly takes over, and the IMF steps in with orthodox economic stabilization policies. In this stage, real wages decline to levels lower than before stage 1. Investment completely dries up. The manufacturing sector decapitalizes with further capital flight. The decline in real wages is explained by the notion that capital can be moved out of countries with poor anti-market policies, while labor is predominantly trapped in those countries. So, an interesting thing that's happening here, because I know a lot of my listeners might be very suspicious of the IMF. I myself have my suspicions as well. I see Yanni van der Walt has dropped into the chat. Thank you, Yanni. I gave you a shout out at the beginning of the stream. Thank you very much. I'm very glad that the sound is coming through nicely. So here's something that you can debate for yourselves and decide for yourself. So if you look at this 4th stage where you pretty much have complete collapse, the IMF steps in and pretty much your country comes under their control. They start calling the shots. Now, if you want to, let's play devil's advocate. Wouldn't it then, for the transatlantic globalists, wouldn't it fit their narrative or their agenda that they then encourage these types of far left redistributive populist parties to get into power in the global south, that destroy those economies then, and then the IMF can pretty much come on, that country comes under the control of all these globalist organizations and larger transatlantic organizations. I mean, just some food for thought. So let's get into Venezuela. And I want to put something on screen here specifically for Venezuela, because we're going to start off by looking at their property rights, because that's the other element of my master's thesis, not just looking at the effects of redistributive left-wing populism on liberal democracies, but also what an alternative policy path like protecting property rights has in regards to outcomes. So let me just put that on screen. I always struggle with the share screen. It distracts me for a few seconds. Let me just see. Chrome tab. All right. You guys can see that. Can I zoom in? No, I can't. Okay. So what you're seeing there is the property right. That is the property rights score of Venezuela, according to the sources there down below. So if you're looking at that score, you can see, so maybe just for some history, Hugo Chavez and his party came into power in 1999. So can you guys see where the drop-off in property rights score begins? I don't think you need a hint. It starts around exactly when his party take power. So it declines from 50 out of 100 to all the way to 0 around 2010, and then goes up a little bit to 10 by 2020. So there's a very drastic drop off, and I'm going to explain why that happened in just a second. So let's just get that off. There we go. All right. So now to explain that graph and why that happened. So in 2001, the Chavez administration passed the land law and the hydrocarbons law, which allowed the government to expropriate so-called idle pieces of land owned by large landlords. Doesn't that sound familiar, that term idle pieces of land? It should sound familiar to you if you're a South African, because that's exactly the type of rhetoric that we're hearing from the ANC. Don't worry, we're just going to expropriate land that's not being worked, land that's idle, land that's lying fallow. But that's how it started in Venezuela as well, targeting idle pieces of land. These laws also further tightened the government's control over the oil industry, granting the state power to determine the leaders within it. Such legislation drastically eroded property rights. So that's where you can see on the graph as well. By the end of 2001, 49 economic laws had been passed by the Chavez regime through presidential decree, which included legislation on land reform. I mean, there's that magic word again, land reform. And increased state control over the oil industry, of course. Chavez described the unequal distribution of land as an injustice that needed to be ended. Again, sounds very familiar. In 2005, Chavez promised to redistribute agricultural land to the poor landless farmers. The Chavez regime started out by redistributing so-called unused state-owned land. Again, very familiar if you're a South African. Unused state-owned land, as well as expropriating uncultivated and fallow land from the large private estates and redistributing it to impoverished citizens. By 2005, the regime had redistributed over 2.2 million hectares to 130,000 impoverished families and cooperatives. So they did do a lot of redistribution, but you're going to see where that leads now and the new shape that it takes on as the time progresses. One of the first intervention orders enforced to expropriate rural property occurred in 2005 when a former army captain with 200 troops arrived at a property targeted for expropriation. The process involved the government commission being given 3 months to decide whether the property is unproductive or not legally held and could thus be turned over to peasant cooperatives under the controversial 2001 land reform decree. Chavez's land reform program was characterized by hundreds of land invasions and activist deaths. Hundreds of land invasions. Again, sounds very familiar. Between 2007 and 2010, a steep decline in Venezuela's property rights score was observed, with minimal improvement between 2010 and 2020. This coincided with Chavez's 2007 inaugural presidential speech, in which he announced the end of the traditional period and declared that people had voted for the implementation of the Simon Bolivar Project, or First Socialist Plan of the Nation, like their version of the National Democratic Revolution, if you're a South African. So just before I continue, I want to put something on screen there regarding that name, because you're going to hear it a lot. I think it's this one. Yeah, there we go. All right. So let me just read that name again. I wonder if, does this zoom in? No, that makes the image smaller. All right. So what we got here, let's just read that again. The implementation of the Simon Bolivar Project, or the First Socialist Plan of the Nation. This plan was approved by the National Assembly in 2007, with one of its key aspects being the replacement of private property with social property, thus relegating private property to the periphery of the economy. This new policy direction also enabled the expansion of state control and intervention in the economy, especially in the food industry. The 2007-2013 national plan's goal stated that, and I quote, the progressive development of social property over the means of production and the implementation of fair, equitable, and solitary exchange systems that are contrary to capitalism. That's what they described it as. Under Chavez and his successor Maduro, major economic sectors such as education, healthcare, and basic foods were decommodified, and nationalization of industries became common, most notably the oil industry in 2001 and the steel, telecommunications, and electric industries in 2007 and 2008. These nationalizations account to a large extent for the sharp decline in the property rights score observed in 2007 and 2008. The majority of enterprises were eventually fully controlled and owned by the government and not by private property owners, who used to make the economic decisions from which they could profit. Between 2007, when the new radical policy path was announced, in 2010, the Chavez regime nationalized the country's oil industry on a much larger scale. The majority of businesses nationalized were redistributed to military officials. Now, here you can see the changing character of this redistribution policy. So it starts off very noble. They're giving farms and property to impoverished Venezuelans. And now it's starting to show its real intentions and its real character. Most of the property now going to military officials. So furthermore, property rights were further eroded by the successful amendment of the Land and Agricultural Development Act of 2000 and in 2005 and 2010, combined with the new Regulation and Control of Rents and Housing Act of 2011. These legislative developments heavily restricted the use of private property and effectively nullified the value of ownership for many who rented it out or those working it in the agricultural sector. So what we see here, and maybe just a last bit of detail there before I discuss it, owners of agricultural land unable to demonstrate ownership prior to 1848 could have their property expropriated. Again, sounds very familiar to South Africa. Whose land was expropriated and to whom it was redistributed was dependent on loyalty to the regime, important, which controlled the courts and the National Assembly. The government response to food shortages was further expropriation of farms. So here you see again the character of this policy strategy taking its true form, with your loyalty to the ruling party determining whether you get land or not. All right. Let's see. I've been not checking the chat. I see you guys are giving some nice feedback here. All right. So next, let's see what the effects were of these policies. So let me just see. So capital flight started immensely affecting the economy and the country. And to limit capital flight and capital leaving the country, Chavez implemented currency controls in 2003. which created a gap between the black market and the official exchange rate. By 2015, the black market rate was 150 times greater than the official rate. Therefore, when the state provided specific individuals or businesses with dollars at a preferential rate in order to increase imports, the recipients resold these dollars on the black market for hefty profits. This exacerbated a problem of scarcity of necessary goods since they were not imported, causing massive inflation. The currency manipulation and price controls applied by the Chavez regime to deal with rapidly rising inflation forced businesses to sell imported goods at a loss. When imported basic necessities became impossible due to a lack of foreign currency, uh, when importing basic necessities became impossible due to a lack of foreign currency, Chavez accused businesses of waging an economic war on the Venezuelan people. The result was the nationalization of any business such as grocery chains and breweries unable to import basic goods. Control over the majority of nationalized businesses was handed to military officials who bankrupted them. The Ornico aluminium and steel industries, which experienced record levels of production in the 1990s, are an example of businesses going bankrupt after being nationalized under Chavez. Under Chavez and Maduro, international companies fled Venezuela on a large scale. So what you're seeing here is just havoc being sown in the economy because all these businesses are being nationalized and they're being given to party loyalists and military officials. So let's continue here. The amendment of the Land and Agricultural Development Act of 2000 in 2005 and 2010, and the new Regulation and Control of Rents and Housing Act of 2011, which restricted the use of private property and nullified ownership for many who rented it out or those working it in the agricultural sector, which enabled further expropriations. The consequence was that by 2016, the majority of the rural properties expropriated on this basis became non-productive. Again, parallels between South Africa. 90% of land reform projects by the government fail miserably. And for the same reasons as here, they're given to people that can't farm. They're being given to people due to loyalty to the government. They're being given to people that have connections within the military, not farmers and people with a background in agriculture. So, agriculture used to be a powerful economic sector providing production and employment, but extensive land expropriations under Chavez, which redistributed land to regime loyalists, collapsed the sector. Venezuela, once a major exporter of agricultural goods, was importing 70% of its basic food needs by 2018. Farmers forced to sell their goods at regulated prices were unable to afford fertilizer, feed, or other farming necessities. These outcomes are paralleled in the case of Zimbabwe, as we'll see now, which also had a robust agricultural sector prior to its collapse due to radical redistributive populist policies. I see Sideline Opinion says intentional destruction of the economy like we see in South Africa now. I think there's a lot of elements that you could say looks very much like it being intentional. So let's get to, I think, let's see if I'm almost done with Venezuela. So, an example of the destructive economic effects on private agriculture of the erosion of property rights is the case of Vesti Company, which normally supplied 4% of the beef consumed in Venezuela. According to the firm, only one small pasture of their farms had not been invaded, resulting in a total crash of their beef production. These land invasions, accompanying Chavez's redistributive populist land reform, mirror the land invasions under Mugabe's land reform program. The devastation of the private agricultural industry further increased the economy's already heavy dependence on oil, further hampering desperately needed economic diversification. The drop in domestic production made Venezuela more dependent on imported food. Having to import more food is significant when you take into account that the government's heavy price controls and currency manipulations resulted in an inability to import basic necessities because of a lack of foreign currency. When the government responded to food shortages with further expropriation of agricultural property, this only exacerbated the shortages since expropriated farms were primarily handed to the corrupt and inefficient military. While under Chavez, Venezuela experienced shortages of basic necessities, under Maduro, his successor, it was suffering from a widespread famine, which 3/4 of Venezuelans lost an average of 90 pounds in weight during 2016. That's some hectic stuff. That's what you call the Maduro diet. Foreign investment outside the petroleum industry declined by 54% between 1998. Chavez came into power in 1999 and 2001. So just in that 3-year period, 54% decline in foreign investment from outside the country. As early as 2003, the Bertelsmann Stichting was expressing concern over the fact that the private sector was exhibiting extreme caution in terms of local investments, specifically due to considerable uncertainty over security of property rights after the new 1999 constitution came into effect. In 2001, the private sector accounted for 62% of GDP, but by 2018, 75% of private businesses had closed. I'm just going to repeat that. So in a time span between 2001 and 2018, 75% of private businesses in Venezuela had closed. Therefore, the erosion of property rights hampered not only domestic investment, but foreign direct investment as well. The Organic Law of Fair Prices in 2014 effectively abolished the price system and banned profit margins over 30%, wreaking further havoc on the economy. Under Maduro, Venezuela's economic woes have drastically worsened, with regular food and medicine shortages accompanied by a rapidly depreciating currency. While shortages occurred under Chavez, they became chronic under Maduro. Famine, shortages of basic medicine, rampant malnutrition, and the deteriorating overall health of the population are hallmarks of the Maduro regime, but their causes can be traced back to the policy of their predecessor. So here's just some economic facts for you. There was in regards to Venezuela and the results of these policies. There was a sharp trend of declining annual GDP growth starting in 2005, reaching a low point of minus 3.2% in 2009, and again contracting by minus 3.89% in 2014. According to the Bertelsmann Stichting, Venezuela GDP growth was minus 6% in 2015, minus 17% in 2016, minus 14% in 2017, minus 18% in 2018. Imagine that, minus 18 economic growth. Between 2013 and 2018, the economy contracted by approximately 45%, accompanied by, that's almost half of the economy just wiped off the map, accompanied by a 75% decline in imports. By 2018, about 50 businesses were closing per day. That's again a stat I'm going to have to repeat. By 2018 in Venezuela, about 50 businesses were closing per day. Yeah, it's insane stuff, this. And I mean, this is the type of country that the ANC in South Africa champions. They think they're doing an excellent job. So, let's see if there's anything else about Venezuela that I think... okay. Yeah, so just some poverty statistics. So, during the early years of Chavez's reign, there was a spike in poverty to a high of 54% in 2003. Between 2004 and 2007, the Chavez regime made considerable progress in lowering poverty levels due to massive social spending from the nationalized oil industry, which then and then the oil price collapsed, and then they couldn't do this anymore. And they also were not spending... They weren't doing social spending on anything sustainable. They were buying like microwaves and fridges for every Venezuelan to artificially raise living standards, but it's not sustainable. So let's see. However, starting in 2007, that trend of poverty reduction leveled off, reaching its lowest point of 27% in 2009. From 2010 onwards, poverty again increased incrementally, returning to 33% in 2015, a number higher than the 31% in 2001, near the start of Chavez's reign. So all those gains were just wiped off again when the money dried up. Health data from 2016 showed an annual increase in infant and maternal mortality rates of 30% and 65%, respectively, a sharp spike in deaths from preventable diseases, and malaria cases rising by 76% year on year. And there's more statistics like that. By 2018, 95% of hospitals in Venezuela were unable to provide sufficient food for their patients. Let's see. There was So in regards to the then there's also the effect that it had on their democracy and civil rights in the country. But that's something you can go check out for yourself. Seeing as we only have an hour tonight to discuss all these things. Let's see if there's just something to highlight there. So yeah, a successful referendum in 2009 sought to end presidential term limits, allowing Chavez to run for re-election indefinitely. Chavez was on course to stay in power permanently, but being diagnosed with cancer changed that trajectory. The authoritarian institutions established under Chavez in order to facilitate increased control over the opposition, the economy, and the media carried over to the Maduro regime, which exploited the erosion of checks on power even more extensively. So then there's also a lot of protester deaths, a lot of rioting, social unrest, political unrest. Here's also a stat that I think is very, very telling. Under Chavez and Maduro, a major shift in power has been observed from private independent media towards state-run media loyal to the regime. In 1998, a year before Chavez took power, Venezuela had 89 newspapers, all privately funded and independent. By 2014, this number of newspapers had increased to 102, of which only 56% were privately owned. In 1998, Venezuela had 24 television channels, of which only 3 were state-funded. By 2014, the number of television channels grew by 104, of which only 46% being privately funded and independent. And then also, so the decrease in independent television channels is most notable in the sphere of local channels, declining from 80% of all channels in 1988 to only 39% in 2014. So when you consider a left-wing populist's view of democracy as the redistribution of wealth by means of a strong state, as outlined by De La Torre 2017, then it is possible to rationalize the media being a mechanism to serve the state rather than being a check on it when you're looking at it through a redistributive populist lens. And then there's also a lot of other facts regarding the press in Venezuela, but you can go check that out for yourself in the link in the description to my full thesis. Let's just get back on track here. Here's something that's very important: the judiciary. Because this is something in South Africa that also needs a lot of attention. Legislation has been a primary mechanism utilized by the Chavez and Maduro regimes to retain power and control. Chavez passed 4 enabling laws empowering the president to rule by decree, and by the year 2015, the Maduro regime had done so once. The use and abuse of law to benefit the regime has been heavily reliant on the overtly partisan, high-level court judges. After 2004, the Chavez regime, like the Mugabe regime in Zimbabwe, packed the courts with loyalists. And don't think the ANC won't do it, or maybe have done it. We don't know. The authoritarian nature of the legislation introduced under Chavez and Maduro, enabled by an absence of separation of powers, was not commonly overt. Their authoritarianism was enabled through the exploitation of a myriad of carefully designed pro-executive clauses, hidden behind a facade of clauses which appeared to empower their citizenry and human rights groups, but laws and regulations which appeared to serve the checks on government power were inconsistently implemented, which was done in order to empower the government rather than the people. So they're very smart with how they use these little clauses in all this legislation. They'll call like a piece of legislation the Empowerment of Civil Society Act, but in actuality, it actually has a little clause in it that if you pull this little one linchpin, the entire thing falls apart. And all these policies that they introduced had this facade of increasing power to the people and increased civil liberties and civil rights, but all it did was really give more power to government with little like self-destruct buttons and small little clauses that the government could exploit through their captured judges. So now we get to Zimbabwe, another very classic case that a lot of you recognize, especially my South African listeners. Zimbabwe is a trip, man. While doing this master thesis and doing all the research for it, for both of these countries, for Venezuela and for Zimbabwe, I was just once again reminded of the depths of human evil in regards to what was happening and what happened in these countries. Yeah, my research led me down some paths that really that disturb you. Some of the facts of that was happening in these countries and how blatantly evil both the Chavez, Maduro, and Mugabe regimes were. There's no denying it. There's no apologetics. Don't take any type of apologetics or justification from anyone for these regimes. They were absolute pure evil. And I know this because I studied them in depth for 2 years. So I know them inside and out. Hey, I see here, Zebaz says, if you can move to Uruguay, many benefits. Well, Uruguay is also, we're going to get to that after Zimbabwe. Uruguay is the next country that we're going to cover. So let's get on to Zimbabwe. Just have to put something on screen. We'll get there now. So let's see here. Where can we begin? Let's start off with let's give the history of the land reform program in Zimbabwe. I think this is important, specifically how it relates to South Africa as well. So in 1979, the 1979 constitution guaranteed property rights for a minimum of 10 years. During the 1990s, the Mugabe regime implemented many land redistribution programs with limited success. Up until 1997, the land reform process was market-driven. Market value determined compensation was paid to owners on a willing buyer, willing seller basis, like in South Africa. And illegal land occupations and land grabs were discouraged by the Mugabe regime. According to the government, the failure of these programs laid the foundation for the radical fast-track land reform policies of the period 1999 to 2002. Here we go. These radical land reform policies overstepped their initial legal and constitutional frameworks in many ways. The ruling ZANU-PF, Mugabe's party, lost its 2/3 parliamentary majority in the 2000 election, restricting its pursuit of further constitutional amendments to erode property rights. The Mugabe regime thus increasingly utilized the extensive presidential powers extended earlier in the pursuit of its goals. So you'll see in Venezuela, I didn't cover that part, but you'll see in both Venezuela and Zimbabwe, the catalyst for increased radical redistributive populist policies was a decrease in support for the ruling party. When the ruling party started being threatened, when their support started to falter, that's when they doubled down on these radical policies. And that's something you need to keep in mind for South Africa, specifically in regards to what's the coming election. It was a donor precondition for financially supporting Zimbabwe's land reform program that the process should be dictated by the land reform and resettlement program to which the government had agreed in 1998. This agreement entailed adherence to the rule of law, stakeholder involvement, and paying full compensation. On the eve of the 2000 election, the Mugabe regime refused to honor the 1998 agreement and severed their talks with the British government on the matter of their financing land reform initiatives. In 2000, between February and June election, about 1,500 white-owned farms were occupied by ZANU-PF-supported land invaders. ZANU-PF ruling party supported land invaders. Between 1999 and 2000, Zimbabwe found itself in a state of political turbulence, which revolved around the issue of establishing representative land ownership and the ruling ZANU-PF desperately clinging on to power. That's also important. After the electorate in the 2000 referendum rejected the amendment of the constitution to grant the state the power to expropriate white-owned farms without compensation, the ZANU-PF launched its fast-track extra-legal land expropriation without compensation and redistribution program. This was spearheaded by the war veteran wing of the party. War veterans, the same type of term the ANC use. They also have their war veterans, born free war veterans that were born after 1994, which began to violently occupy and redistribute white farms to the politically connected. Again, the same pattern that emerged in Venezuela emerged in Zimbabwe. Land redistribution is just an avenue to rewarding party loyalists and people loyal to the party and punishing those that are not loyal to the party. It's very simple. That's how they keep control. You punish those that don't support the ruling party, and then they reward those that, with the spoils that they've plundered and stolen from those that are not loyal to the party, they give to the party loyalists. That's how the Mugabe regime did it. If the ANC go through with expropriation, that's how they're going to do it as well. And that's why they're doing it as well. The Mugabe administration tabled the Rural Land Occupiers Protection from Eviction Act in 2001. Again, sound very familiar if you're South African, which undermined and prohibited any legal efforts of commercial farmers to deal with illegal land occupations. This demonstrates how during its fast-track land reform program, ZANU-PF abandoned its initial opposition to illegal land invasions, which had characterized its stance on the issue during the 1990s. For more radical redistributive populist policies to ensure political survival, while blatantly disregarding the potential consequences for the economy, rule of law, and democracy. So there you have it. That's how they achieved it. You need to pay attention to the Zimbabwe case. It's very, very important. Was my friend Robert Daigen always says, first a global South Africa, then a global Zimbabwe. In October 2001, the newly reshuffled Supreme Court, with a new Chief Justice and 3 new justices, all brand spanking new, reversed all previous court rulings that any land seizures forming part of the fast-track land reform program had been illegal. So now it's open season. Now people can the government is sending a very unambiguous message to the people. You can seize as much land and invade as much land as you want. There will be no consequences for you. In the build up to and then they can also use that reasoning when the international community asks them, hey, what's going on here? Why are these farms being invaded? They can say, well, washing my hands, I don't have anything to do with it. These are lawless people. They are not representative of the ruling party, but while when the international community's backs are turned, the ruling party just gives free rein to everyone to invade as much land as they want. In the build-up to the 2002 elections, in the Commercial Farmers Union versus the Minister of Lands, Agriculture and Rural Resettlement and others case, the Supreme Court ruled that the land acquisition program was lawful since the government had restored the rule of law. It upheld the Rural Land Occupiers Protection from Eviction Act, which prohibited the eviction of land invaders, illegal land invaders, as constitutional. That's it, man. That's Africa, dude. That's how it works. It's constitutional to illegally invade someone's land, and then the legal landowner can do nothing about it. The court also ruled that the government now had an enforceable land reform program in compliance with the constitution. That's like I remember an ANC politician once saying as well, he was asked by a reporter, will expropriation without compensation be legal according to the constitution? He says, yes, it will absolutely will be. We're just going to change the constitution to ensure that it is. Kevin Nicklin, I have to agree with you. The British have caused a lot of trouble in many countries around the world. A lot of meddling, but that's a topic for another night. So let's see if this is important. Oh yeah, so the Mugabe regime So since not, let's see. So the Mugabe regime set about addressing land. So this is earlier on land reform in a corrupt and inefficient way. When 18 months after independence in 1980, the government bought 435,000 acres of white-owned agricultural land, but distributed it to fewer than 3,000 poor black Zimbabweans. The majority of expropriated land was redistributed to cabinet ministers and the party. So here's an important fact that a lot of people don't know. About 80% of all the white owned commercial farms had been purchased since 1980 through the real estate market. In 1980, Zimbabwe gained independence. And since then, 80% of the white owned commercial farmers had been purchased through the real estate market. So it's not like land that was taken 200 years ago and it's still on that family. It was legally bought after independence when there was a black government. Let's see. Here's another important fact. Expanding government patronage and an increasingly competitive international environment in the late 1980s put increasing strain on the economy. In 1990, the Mugabe regime half-heartedly implemented a collection of structural adjustment and deregulation programs, with sectors at the head of their government patronage being overlooked, only to start abandoning them again in 1990. So in 1990, the government went bankrupt, and that's why then the support started dipping, and also why the radical policies were implemented then to remain in power. State employment expanded dramatically under Mugabe, with the majority of new positions being allocated to ZANU-PF loyalists. In 2009, in order to curb hyperinflation crisis, which made Zimbabweans reluctant to use the Zimbabwean dollar because prices were doubling daily, the government ceased the use of the Zimbabwean dollar as a currency and adopted a multi-currency system. Inflation was briefly subdued, but the period of stability that followed was short-lived. After Mugabe's ZANU-PF regained control in 2013 general elections, social spending surged, destabilizing the economy once again. In 2014, with an ongoing liquidity crisis, the central bank adopted an additional 4 currencies, thereby increasing the range of multi-currency system to 9 currencies. Imagine that. I see here that the one and only Joe Emilio is in chat. He says, I'll be live at 8 p.m. peeps. Come chat with me about a 15 million rand stadium and the protest that happened this weekend. Article is out on it. Yeah, go check it out. Joe Emilio's channel. Good guy, good content. So let's continue. Here's the property rights now. So maybe just let's get the graph. I'm going for the graph. There we go. There's property rights in Zimbabwe. So you can see land expropriation starts in 1990, well, between 1997 and 2002. That's when the major land expropriations happen. And look at that property rights score drop from 50 to 10. Stays at 10, drops below 10, I think close to 5 there, goes back to 10, and then 2016 it goes up again. But I'll tell you why that happened in just a second. So let's see, where's the, yeah. So in 2004, all agricultural land was nationalized when farmland titles were abolished and replaced by 99-year government leases, which immediately rendered all title deeds and mortgages related to farmland worthless. For the first time in post-independence history of Zimbabwe, laws protecting and enforcing property rights were no longer adhered to or defended by the government. In many cases, landowners were given a matter of days, sometimes mere hours, to vacate their property earmarked for expropriation. This is evil, folks. This is not a regime that you can sweet talk or apologize for. This is an evil, evil regime. The state enforces demographically based ownership interests in residential and urban commercial properties, the Zimbabwean state, while all agricultural land has been nationalized. A heavily politicized judiciary and high levels of corruption have further greatly undermined property rights in Zimbabwe. So the collapse of the agricultural sector is the key to understanding the Zimbabwean case study. So let's see what happened there. So, in order to encapsulate the economic consequences of Mugabe's radical redistributive policies, the collapse of Zimbabwe's agricultural sector needs to be carefully unpacked and examined thoroughly. As in Venezuela, the export orientated agricultural sector of Zimbabwe was one of the most productive sectors in the economy and was the primary driver behind the substantial economic growth rates of the 1980s and 1990s. The sector was left relatively untouched for about 17 years of post independence rule and became a target for expropriation after support for Mugabe's ZANU PF started to falter in the late 1990s. The destruction of property rights and the resulting insecurity were the main causes behind the collapse of the sector. So, let's see. Skipping a little bit. There's a lot of meat on here. Like I said, if you're interested in the full thesis, you can. There's a link in the description. You can go check it out. So, yeah. So here's actually something that I think it's pretty obvious, but it needs to be pointed out. Traditionally, commercial farmers relied on their property as collateral to secure loans and to buy seeds and fertilizer. Farmers now had to lease their farms from the government, making them unable to use the land as collateral. New farmers could thus not raise the required capital to farm. As cases of expropriation without compensation increased, banks became increasingly reluctant to provide loans to commercial farmers. If you're a farmer, you know how devastating this is because of the increasing uncertainty and risk. The consequence was a drastic decline in loans, which in turn had a ripple effect across various sectors. By 2004, 13 of Zimbabwe's 41 banking institutions experienced a financial crisis, being unable to foreclose on properties with title deeds they held as security being rendered worthless. An estimated 5.3 billion US dollars worth of land value was erased. In 2001, the resulting loss of equity in the agricultural sector exceeded the total amount of aid the World Bank had provided Zimbabwe, and it exceeded it by 249%. So let's just go there again. So in 2001, the resulting loss of equity in the agricultural sector exceeded the total amount of aid the World Bank had provided Zimbabwe by 242%. Insane. So let's see. Between 2000 and 2003, the height of the expropriation without compensation, the production of the cash crops the agricultural sector relied on for income declined by between 50 and 90%. In the financial year 1999-2000, commercial farmers planted 200,000 hectares. By 2000 to 2001, it had declined to 90,000, and by 2001-2002 to only 50,000 hectares. So I want to get to the hyperinflation. That's insane. There's some numbers that you can't even comprehend. So again, I'm skipping over quite a lot, seeing as this is a a very long document. But you can, like I said, check it out in the description, read it for yourself. Let's see. In 8 of the 9 years between 1999 and 2008, Zimbabwe experienced negative economic growth. 8 out of those 9 years. The economic downturn started in 1999 with expropriation without compensation, with the economy contracting by approximately 1%, followed by a minus 3% contraction in 2000, a plus 1 growth in 2001, a minus 9% contraction in 2002, a minus 17% contraction of the economy in 2003, a minus 6% contraction in 2004, minus 6 contraction in 2005, minus 3 contraction in 2006, minus 4 contraction in 2007, and minus 18% in 2008. This is a mirror of Venezuela. It's not economic decline. It's catastrophic failure. It's not your car having a little bit of engine trouble. It's your car stopping next to the road and exploding, bursting into flames. It's insane. Minus 18% contraction. Let's go. Foreign direct investment. That's another angle, but yeah, we can skip that. Here's the inflation statistics. So before that, I just want to put something on screen. So let's put that on screen. 1 second. Here we go. Okay. So there's a representation of what I'm going to tell you now. Here we go. Are you ready? Radical redistributive policies of the Mugabe regime led to periods of hyperinflation between 2003 and 2009. The Reserve Bank of Venezuela was unable to report any meaningful economic data during most of 2008. Hank and Kwok were, however, able to calculate the inflation rate during that time. Here come some numbers that you're going to have to put your thinking cap on to comprehend. I don't think I struggle to wrap my head around it. In October 2008, the year on year inflation rate reached 3.8 quintillion percent. That's 10 by the power of 18 inflation. In November 2008, hyperinflation peaked at 89 sextillion percent. That's 10 to the 21 power percent inflation. That's how you get $1 trillion note. I actually have one here. I don't know where it is now. I'm going to have to. I'll put it in the background of a future stream. Yeah, quintillion and sextillion. It's you can't comprehend it. Yeah, the inflation is off the charts. When I was creating charts for this master thesis, it wouldn't have fit on them. So I hope that's not the Rona. So let's see. So here's an answer to the Zimbabwe apologists or the Mugabe apologists. One explanation given for the economic collapse of Zimbabwe points to international sanctions as the primary cause. Let me just stop screen sharing here. All right. So remember this whenever you encounter the sanctions narrative. Oh, Zimbabwe wasn't destroyed by expropriation without compensation. The international community sanctioned it. That's why. Well, here's the answer to that if you ever encounter it. And this was a narrative of the Mugabe regime. Their propaganda is pretty low tier. However, sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe by the European Union states and the United States solely targeted 86 ZANU-PF officials and their families, so not the economy. The American companies were still free to invest in and trade with Zimbabwe. A second explanation pins the state of their economic ruin on a 2000 and 2001 drought. Historical data, however, indicate that between 2000 and 2001, the annual rainfall was only 22% below Zimbabwe's 50-year average, with rainfall averages returning to normal levels by 2000. So a one-year drought led to catastrophic failure of the economy. Give me a break. Zimbabwe's irrigation and dam infrastructure, with about 11,000 reservoirs, is so extensive that it should have been sufficient to deal with a drought. Richardson found that between 1981 and 1998, there was a strong correlation between annual rainfall and GDP growth. After the fast-track land reform program was initiated in 2000, this correlation was broken, with economic growth continuing to free fall despite rainfall recovering by 2002. So their myth busted. The myth of international sanctions broke Venezuela, broke Zimbabwe. Absolute bullshit, absolute myth. The myth that Zimbabwe was broken by a massive drought, also absolute myth, not true government propaganda. So let's see here. So, at the end of Mugabe's reign in 2017, when he resigned, the net result of his radical redistributive policies was an economy and country significantly worse off in various regards than it was at independence 37 years ago, while neighboring Botswana flourished. According to Asimoglu and Robinson, 2013, Zimbabwe's long-term post-independence economic performance has been worse than before independence. Zimbabwean economist John Robertson said in 2018, and I quote, "In Zimbabwe, nobody feels safe when the state can authorize itself to take people's property. This country will recover fast if government promises to respect property rights and revives the rule of law. So maybe just the last thought there on Zimbabwe, and that is their poverty statistics. Zimbabwe, let me just, I'm checking the chat. Thanks for your. Kevin Nicklin says myth busted, but international community did F all about it. Yeah, well, yeah, there was very little intervention. That's not a lie. Accurate observation. So, Zimbabwe has by far the highest percentage of citizens consistently living below the poverty line of all the cases I examined in my thesis. Between 2001 and 2017, the percentage of Zimbabweans living below the poverty line remained relatively constant and high. According to Asimoglu and Robertson, per capita income of Zimbabwe in 2008 was half of what it was in 1980 when it gained independence and when ZANU-PF came into power. The healthcare situation has deteriorated notably since 2000, with the country experiencing the deadliest cholera outbreak in Africa for 15 years between 2008 and 2009. Most of the improvements in healthcare during the 1980s and early 90s have therefore been reversed, and all the overall healthcare situation has regressed from where it was in 1980. Okay. Here's a funny one, because this is what we saw in Venezuela as well. An estimated 3 million Zimbabweans, or approximately 25% of the total population, have immigrated since 2000, with the majority moving to neighboring South Africa or Botswana, where property rights are defended. In Venezuela, redistributive populist policies, the erosion of property rights, and the economic and political consequences of this have also fueled mass immigration. A lot of it also to Uruguay, that country, the other case study that I looked at. Interestingly, in the case of both Zimbabwe and Venezuela, a large portion of the immigrants moved to the other two countries examined in this thesis, the two polar opposites in regards to policy. Operation Marambatsvina in 2005 is an example of where the erosion of property rights became a tool to displace and oppress the poor. In this forced eviction campaign, intended to clean urban areas, about 300,000 Zimbabweans lost their homes due to eviction and or demolition in an area populated largely by the leading opposition party, the MDC, by their supporters. So again, political targeting. This operation breached a myriad of national and international human rights laws dealing with eviction and resulted in a humanitarian crisis. So if you want to read up on that, I'm going to put that in the chat, just that operation's name, if you want to go do some research. Operation Marambatsvina. Go check it out. Remember, don't just believe what I say, research what I say. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. So there's an effect on the liberal democracy there as well, but I'm going to skip that, seeing as we're already an hour in, and I still need to get to Botswana and Uruguay, but they're brief because their stories are very simple in regards to their success. And Patria podcast is here. Dumela. So let's see. And then there's also the judiciary. This is just one important thing that I need to get to before we get to Uruguay. Also, maybe, yeah, let's cover this quickly. We can get to it. So, prior to the parliamentary election in June 2000, Mugabe's ZANU-PF intimidated opposition, tightened its control over the media, and increased radicalism of its populist land reform rhetoric. All elections between 2000 and 2002 involved intense violence, voter intimidation, acts of state coercion, as ZANU-PF forces terrorized the opposition. In 2002, the MDC, the official opposition, published a list of 89 of its supporters who had died in ZANU-PF attacks. Violence by ZANU-PF was most prevalent in the provinces where their support was weak or dwindling. In 2007, Morgan Tsvangirai, leader of the MDC opposition, along with other opposition members and civil society activists, were brutally beaten. In the wake of this inconclusive 2008 elections, state-sponsored forces violently assaulted pro-MDC supporters. And then there's also... In 2001, the printing press of an independent newspaper critical of the regime, the Daily News, was destroyed, and editors and journalists working for the independent publication were detained and beaten. The Daily News was banned in 2003 under the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act. The Mugabe regime increased extensive control over the media in order to limit the impact of any opposition and to optimize its own image. So let's see. A judiciary. This is very important for the South African case. So in 1990, Mugabe abolished the Senate and introduced positions in the legislature which he could nominate. In 2000, the Zimbabwean Supreme Court declared the Mugabe regime's fast-track land reform program unconstitutional, which Mugabe ignored. Preceding this development, the Mugabe regime had adhered to court orders and allowed the appeal process to run its course. Mugabe subsequently replaced uncooperative judges with loyalists, which enabled him to change the aforementioned ruling in 2001. So now it's no longer unconstitutional. Funny how that works. Under the Mugabe regime, specifically in the late 1990s and early 2000s, judges were frequently threatened with violence by state-sponsored forces if they were going to challenge the government's agenda. In 2001, the Chief Justice, who had fought against political capture of the judiciary, resigned and was replaced by a regime loyalist. Now we get to Uruguay. Uruguay and Botswana next, but there's only 3 pages left. This is going to be very brief because I don't have like a laundry list of crimes against humanity and brutal human rights violations that I have to bring to your attention, as with the case with Venezuela and Zimbabwe. Let's go. Let's see. Between 2003 and 2015, Uruguay experienced an unbroken trend of positive economic growth. So 2003 to 2015, unbroken trend of positive economic growth, with economic growth exceeding 4% every year between 2004 and 2013. That's insane. Contrast that to during the same period where Venezuela and Zimbabwe are experiencing -18, -17, -16 annual economic growth contractions. Here, winning streak, W's everywhere. While Venezuela and Zimbabwe are taking L's, Uruguay is loving the W's. So poverty, the substantial and sustained decline in the percentage of the Uruguayan population living below the poverty line gradually improved from 32% in 2006 to 7.9% in 2017. So a decline from 32% to 7.9% between 2006 and 2017. That's insanely good. So that's pretty much just flexing with Uruguay. Let me just show you what they. So you remember what the graphs looked like for the other 2 countries when it comes to private property rights score. Let me show you what Uruguay's private property rights score looks like. Here we go. How about that? So while the other countries, Venezuela and Zimbabwe, their private property rights score looks like a plane crashing, Uruguay is cruising, man. Uruguay is comfortably cruising at 70 out of 100. I think it's in the top 40 countries in the world, if I remember correctly, in regards to property rights. And it's at the top or second from the top in Latin America. It's insanely good. So to make of that what you will. The correlation I found in my thesis was that there is a correlation. And I mean, the stats that I just quoted, speak for themselves. So let's move on to Botswana, which has a little bit more meat on it that I want to cover because their story is miraculous. Botswana has experienced incredible economic growth rates since independence in 1966, despite the unfavorable conditions and deficiencies that were present in 1966, as outlined that's in a previous chapter. Economic growth peaked in 1972 at 26%, and in the 51 years, as Jacob Zuma would say, listen carefully. In the 51 years since 1996, when Botswana gained independence, annual GDP growth has dropped below zero only twice in 51 years. Only 2 years out of 51, it was below zero, in 2009 and 2015. For perspective, the average sub-Saharan African country is poorer than the global average low-income country, and this trend is worsening. Between 1965 and at least 2003, the average growth rate of countries in sub-Saharan Africa that surround Botswana has been negative, while Botswana is just cruising at 51 years of sustained economic growth, only 2 out of those 51 years it being negative. Botswana has defied this regional trend. Between 1965 and 1998, the same time period where sub-Saharan Africa is experiencing negative economic growth, Botswana's economy grew at an average annual rate of 7.7%. See, a sideline opinion says, thanks for posting a link to Adams's thesis, Hendo. Great references. Yeah, thank you very much, Hendo. Much appreciated. I'll just put that on the screen. If you want to type it out, if you're lazy, link in the description that you can click to read the full one. Let's see. I'm looking for some stats that you guys will find interesting, not just small incremental improvements. Okay, so it could be argued that Botswana's steady economic growth record is the consequence of limited government intervention in the economy. Robinson et al. Argue that this cannot be the case since the government has intervened heavily in the economy in terms of detailed planning and the central government expenditure making up approximately 40% of GDP by 2003, which is a ratio higher than Africa's average. Robinson et al. Regard the sound institutions of Botswana as the main contributors to its economic growth, specifically the institutions which protected and enforced private property rights. So that's important. I think that's maybe a controversial point even. Poverty stats. Are you ready for like a miracle story? The percentage of the population that lived below the poverty line decreased. The percentage of the Botswana population that lived below the poverty line decreased from 59% in 1985 to 19% in 2009. Still high, but from 59 to 19, that's pretty damn good. The country's impressive record of declining poverty rates is primarily the result of the substantial portion of the mineral wealth revenues being invested by the government in social spending, specifically to improve education and healthcare. Primary school enrollment improved from 66,000 in 1966 to 319,000 in 1995. Infant mortality fell from 100 per 1,000, 1 in 10 live births in 1971 to 45 in 1991. So still very high, but very good improvement. By 1998, Botswana boasted a purchasing power parity adjusted per capita income of $5,796, which was almost 4 times the continent's average. In 2013, Botswana had the highest per capita income in sub-Saharan Africa, equal to the most successful Latin American countries. This is in stark contrast to the case of Zimbabwe, where, as noted, by 2008, per capita income was half of what it was at independence in 1980. The diamond industry revenues have been effectively and prudently utilized in order to continuously and systematically expand the country's infrastructure, especially for education and healthcare. The private sector has consistently been an indispensable source of support in developing education. So maybe just something there that I need to highlight now that we're talking about diamonds. Because I mean, you could easily make the argument that it's just the diamonds that made Botswana rich. But I think there's some things that we need to highlight. So firstly, when Botswana gained independence, Botswana was one of the world's most impoverished impoverished countries in 1966. And at the time, Botswana only had 12 kilometers of paved roads, no electricity system, no university, two secondary schools offering 5-year courses, 100, 100 people with a secondary education, and only 22 Tswana speaking graduates from South African universities. Against these odds, Botswana became one of Africa and the modern world's great economic growth and development success stories. So let's just see. The protection of property rights in Botswana and Uruguay contributed significantly to investor-friendly economies, attracting large amounts of foreign direct investment. Venezuela and Botswana were both rich. So here's the thing, because when you say, well, it's just diamonds that made Botswana rich, both Venezuela and Botswana were rich in a natural resource. Venezuela has here's another fact that you might not know. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. But they nationalized all of it, and then the industries collapsed, and then they got to the point where they couldn't get the oil out of the ground due to the catastrophic collapse. I mean, imagine the irony. So Botswana negotiated a mutually so in contrast to Venezuela, just greedily trying to take all the natural resources for the government and nationalizing everything. Botswana negotiated a mutually beneficial deal with the diamond industry on the basis of respecting property rights. The diamond industry thus became the engine of the economy, with the government reinvesting the split revenues to the country's benefit. So what we see happen here is that Botswana knew there's a lot of natural resources here that they can exploit. They could go the greedy route and just take it all and say, we're nationalizing all of it, taking the tap and directly routing it to government. But they know that's going to destroy the industry and they're going to end up with nothing. That's the resource curse. But they realize there's a lot of private companies that also want to mine here, and they want a slice of that pie, and they are willing to split their revenues 50-50 just to get a slice of that pie. I mean, that's a good deal, 50-50. And that's the route they took, and they took that 50% that they gained, and they also invested that into all these industries. So let's see. I just wanted to. There's one more meme that I want to put on the screen before we end off. Here we go. So apparently Botswana has a very large death metal scene, and they dress like that. Death metal cowboys, I think, is what they're called. So yeah. So yeah, that's one more thing that I realized while doing this master's thesis is that. So I started off with researching Botswana and Uruguay, and the information. Wait, let me just stop sharing here. And the information is very clear, very easy to find. Statistics, inflation numbers, GDP, everything. Everything is there. Very easy to find. A student's dream. I'm like, this is going to be so easy. Botswana, Uruguay, done, dusted, boom. Then I get to Venezuela and Zimbabwe, and there's just, I kid you not, information blackouts, just these gaps where the Venezuelan or Zimbabwe government is just inflation. It's not a necessary statistic. Who cares about it? It doesn't indicate anything. It's of no worth. You don't need to know. During the worst hyperinflation periods, there's just no data. So I had to go through other sources that calculated it during those times. So that's one of the things that stood out to me. The countries that had something to boast about, they're like, yeah, here, have everything. High detail, our success stories. Here's all the stats. The government's not doing so well. They claim they're doing very well. But when you want to see the numbers, like, nah, you don't know. You don't need to know. It's not important. So thank you very much for tuning in, guys. This was just seeing as I've got my opinion piece out now on Politics Web, going through some of this overview of this thesis of mine that I got last year at the University of Stellenbosch, graduated cum laude for my master's thesis. So I'm very chuffed with that for this thesis. And yeah, you can, like I said, in the description, you can go read the full one if you want. There's also an overview of this thesis that you can find in the description, the politics web link that's also there. It also gives some other facts that I didn't get to during the stream. So you can go check that out as well if this topic interests you. So maybe just an overview, very short. Redistributive populist policies. What I found was that they, in the short term, because they prioritize the short term, they lead to some improvements in poverty reduction and living standard increases. But then you get to the longer timeline and the money runs out. And then when they can't make good on their promises, support dips for the party. And then they have to start lower. Then when that support starts dipping, both in Zimbabwe and Venezuela, that's when they double down on their redistributive populist policies and things start getting really nutty. That's where you get hyperinflation into the sextillions, 10 to the 21th power. So, yeah. Also, maybe just another observation there. So, long term, short term, protecting property rights and enforcing property rights over the long term, very good track record in Uruguay and Botswana. Economic growth and poverty reduction, very, very good when it comes to that. Also, when what we saw in Botswana and Uruguay is that when property rights are protected and enshrined, then that also it also defeats the temptation for radical redistributive populist parties to gain power or to be palatable to the population, because the economy is growing, there's jobs, poverty is decreasing, things are going well. Therefore, and population knows that's due to property rights being protected. So if any politician like a Julius Malema type stands up and says we need expropriation without compensation, the people of that country, seeing the fruits of private property being protected, are going to tell them to go take a hike, because then their livelihoods would be in danger, and all this positive growth would be in danger. Before I continue with the analysis, Leuven Janse van Rensburg gives 200 Rand and says, Dankie CC, enjoy your new domicile. Van Gert in Leuven. I don't know what a domicile is. What's that? The country that a person treats as their permanent home or lives in and has a substantial connection with. Treat a specified country as a permanent home. Domicile. I'm probably not pronouncing it right. I know what you mean now. You're meaning the new place that I moved in. Well, thank you very much. I've never heard that word. I've never heard it spoken. That's why you'll probably hear that I'm not pronouncing it right. But thank you very much. Baie dankie, van Gert. Well, van Gert nie. Baie dankie, Gert, in Leuven. Ek waardeer dit baie. En ja, no, you taught me a new word today. Thank you very much. I'll remember that. I'm going to have to figure out how to pronounce that. But yeah, thank you very much for the super chat. 73 Elephant says, good stuff. Thanks for sharing it with us. Roy van Sail, nog 'n van Sail, goeienaand, says, very interesting. Thank you. Christoph Havenga says, good talk. Thank you, Ernst. Let's see. The Freighter Watcher, hey, how's it going? Says, congratulations on your academic success. Thank you very much. Sideline Opinion says, South Africa must take note. We are being led down the same garden path as Venezuela and Zimbabwe. Absolutely. Yeah, I see. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's a new word that I've learned. I'm pretty sure I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but thank you. Oh, my vocabulary has expanded. Thank you, Defrader Watcher. Everyone. Dom A. Sile. All right. Now everyone's just helping with the pronunciation. Thank you very much. JN77 says, we have domicile in German, but apparently that doesn't make it to Dutch. Hendo says, do share this live stream. Yeah, please share it. It really helps out the show. All right. So maybe just there's a last few things that I wanted to get to. So in the long term, private property really on top, and the thing about redistributive populism is there's a little bit of improvement, and then there's just not, like I said, not just a little bit of failure or stagnation or gradual failure. It's catastrophic, sudden failure. It's like falling off a cliff. I mean, it's not like the economy is like, it's like through the floor. So yeah, take this as a word of warning. And the other message for anyone, if you encounter someone that makes apologetics for the countries like the regimes of Venezuela and the Mugabe regime, the Chavez regime, Maduro regime, don't take it. They are absolutely evil regimes. Not good. Hindo posts a little coffee and a cookie. Thank you very much. So, sideline opinion. Again, my woordeskat is ook besig om toe te neem of uit te brei, moet ek eerder sê. Sideline opinion says domicilium in Afrikaans, jou woonadres. Baie dankie Sideline opinions. Nou is dit sommer my woordeskat ook uitgebrei. The Fredo Watcher says US American Epics called it your pad. All right. Thank you very much for tuning in, guys. Tonight's show went a little bit longer than usual, but there was a lot to cover. Thank you very much for everyone that took part in the live chat, the chat section. Thank you again for the super chats. I hope my new microphone levels are to your liking. I hope they are blessing your eardrums. I hope I'm coming through loud and clear. If you have any type of feedback there, always appreciated. Be Smart says residenti in Dutch. Hinda says you learn something new every day. All right. So thank you very much, guys. If you leave a like, that also helps out the show. If you're new here, if you like this type of content, you can subscribe. Also, I've got a Telegram channel where you can get up-to-date updates on when I go live or any other content that I create. Link in the description. Ek het ook 'n Afrikaanse kanaal vir enigiemand wat belangstel aan Afrikaans of Afrikaanse politieke analise. Daar is 'n kanaal vir dit of 'n skakel vir dit in die beskrywing. In alle erns sy naam. And then also you can share this if you found this stream entertaining or interesting. You can go share it on social media. I really appreciate it. Gets new people to the channel and adds to the community we're building here. But yeah, it was very fun reading your comments as always. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you guys have an excellent evening. Enjoy the rest of your week and God bless.